Imagine probing into the affairs of a confirmed bachelor, finding the skeleton of a lean love story dead for many years, bringing it forth and showing it to the gossiping public with all the pride of an African explorer who has shot a lion with the latest German howitzer.
David Strain, 27th of April, 1921. David Harbison Strain was born in 1896 in County Down. His father, a linen merchant, was a strict and often bad-tempered Presbyterian and an authority figure in their rural church community of Knockbracken. David was educated at the elite Royal Belfast Academical Institution, but instead of going up to university, he joined the family firm based in central Belfast. The Strain family had moved to upmarket Galwally Park, located on the city's expanding southern edge, in David's youth. Other Strain sons married and moved out, but number 5 remained his home until he moved with his widowed mother back into the country in the late 1930s. David was a daily diary writer and barely missed an entry between 1920 and 1943. When he died of a stroke in 1969, these diaries, well over 1 million words, were deposited in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, along with his photo albums, newspaper scrapbooks and letters. The diaries were catalogued briefly, without a hint of the rich and exceptionally rare material they contain, and so have remained virtually unknown to the world. As a diarist, David Strain was fastidious about recording not just his own feelings and thoughts about homosexuality, but also the many conversations he had with other gay men. The survival of these diaries thus gives a remarkable window onto a queer world that would otherwise be almost entirely invisible, limited to the sparse criminal records of men who were arrested for having sex in public. We might have expected to find an intensely difficult and ultimately failed life, racked with guilt and shame, but that is not the picture that David paints. Instead, the arc of his diaries depicts a journey of discovery, from isolation and ignorance to a vibrant queer world of sexual desire, love, and community. The opening years of the diary, when David was in his mid-20s to early 30s, are fairly mundane. They describe attending church or organ recitals with his mother, travelling out to the old family farm, horse riding, or driving around the Northern Irish countryside in his beloved Triumph. Even then, in among the long and often repetitive entries, there are hints that he was longing for a different life. David often toyed with the idea of trying to court women, but understood that he was more drawn toward men. One of the earliest experiences David had of trying to understand and express his desires came from his close friendship with Wallace Bamford, a dairy farmer's son who was about 5 years his junior. At first the friendship developed well, with frequent drives together and Sunday evening visits at David's family home. In September 1927, David was optimistic.
I am inclined to think he has the same feelings as I have in regards to friendship between men. I don't just know as yet whether he has the same love for me as I have for him. He may have someone else in mind, but there is no doubt he is treading his way along the same path as I am on.
When the friendship ultimately faltered, after it became clear that Wallace was not of the same mind, David could barely hide his despair.
Wallace Bamford did not turn up. Needless to say, I was exceedingly disappointed, after impressing on him last Sunday night to be sure and come tonight. He surely must have known when he saw me on the way to Knockbracken. It would have been quite an easy thing for him to have stopped the car and told me he would not be up. Just shows he is not any better than any other, and almost proves the saying, some friendships which we make sacrifices to preserve are not worth having. Sacrifices? What sacrifices have I made? Why, my run to Craigavon with him on this day a fortnight ago was really only undertaken after a very great mental struggle with my conscience. I accompanied him in his motor car against all my principles for Sabbath day observance, so as not to hurt him in any way, as he might have then thought that it was merely that I would not go with him. But perhaps I expect too much. A silk purse from a sow's ear. It is at times like this that I feel so absolutely forsaken. Nobody seems to care for me, further than the everyday common or garden acquaintance. None one can put a real trust in, absolutely sure that you have their utmost sympathy. No matter where you turn, it is the same. It makes me feel, is life worth living?
Other attempts at finding a special companion continued in the late 1920s and are described in bleak depth in his diaries. But David was ultimately disappointed and tortured by jealousy when these young men found girlfriends and left his company. He did not have the language to describe who he was or what he wanted, and could only rely on suggestive passages in old novels or poetry about close but ultimately chaste male friendship. For now, David Strain's experiences confirmed what most have assumed about life before the gay rights movement: isolation, ignorance, and despair. But even in provincial Belfast, there was an alternative world, one that existed only just out of plain sight. The turning point in David Strain's life came in June 1931, when he stumbled across the left-wing Progressive bookshop in Belfast city centre. After spotting some pamphlets in the window about the tragic life of Oscar Wilde, David made his way inside. Digging deeper into these pamphlets, a whole new world opened up in front of him.
Business as usual. Whilst out on tour around town for the Varnish Company, I came across the Progressive bookshop in Union Street. I saw one or two little 3-inch blue books in the window. Some of the titles related to Oscar Wilde, so I went in and asked to see them. I got 3. 1, The Harlot's House and Other Poems. 2, The Tragic Story of Oscar Wilde's Life. And 3, Recollections of Oscar Wilde. 2 and 3 made marvellous reading. Positively amazing. I can now understand myself better than ever. Evidently, my love for my own sex is not at all an unnatural thing. There's a passage on page 30 of number 3 which refers to shameless kissing of stable boys, etc. And on the other side of the fence, how Wilde entertained as the proud and dignified friend of fine and simple ladies. I like myself, only I have been able to control and not give an expression to my desires. In explaining, or perhaps excusing Wilde's conduct, the author of this little book, Charles I. Finger, says that Wilde was only following the ways of the early Dorian Greeks, who had boy lovers.
The next day, David went back and bought another pamphlet, published recently in the USA. It was even franker.
Got Blue Booklet number 692, Homosexual Life. I was greatly surprised on reading it to learn that in some instances the homosexualist or Uranian as a lover is considered purer than the natural lover. Well, this is exactly what I told Andy Brown when he was scornfully speaking of some fellow he knew as a fruit merchant. I told him that leaving out the lustful tendencies, man's love for man was perfect and not at all like man's love for woman. I also said that he would not class a male prostitute in the same class as a male lover, in the same way as he would not class a female prostitute with a pure woman. This sentiment is also mentioned in the booklet. Strange that I should have these feelings for so many years and only now, when I am near 35, learn the truth.
From then on, David made it his mission to find as much gay reading material as he could. He scoured the pages of the more liberal newspapers for references to works about the intermediate sex, had them ordered into local Belfast bookshops, and even managed to come across gay novels in the infamous second-hand book market in Smithfield. Enlightened by new knowledge, David now became increasingly bold, even to the extent of basically outing himself to his mother. He describes one evening in 1933.
My mother was sewing in front of the fire. I mentioned that this was the anniversary of Oscar Wilde's death 30 years ago. She said she saw that there was a Wilde on the cricket team which was playing in Australia and wondered if it was any relation of his. Hardly, I said. You see, his family changed their name after he was sentenced to prison. What did he do? She asked a question she has put to me very often. Nothing very desperate, I replied. Only he did not behave as most society would like, therefore they found fault with him. Was he a sodomite? She asked. Well, he was blamed for that, I said, controlling myself as best as I could. Well, he certainly was a bad man there, she said. I don't agree. I would not for a minute say that he was a bad man. There was never any definite charge of that against him. That book I read the other night, she said, referring to Little Victims, was a filthy book, and it made reference to that. I told your father the kind of immoral stuff you were reading. If it had not been that Margaret was here, I would have burned it. Oh, well, that would only have put me to the expense of buying another one, I said. I have suspected for the past number of weeks that my mother knew perfectly well, very probably asked my father what Wilde was put in jail for. Whether she and he have any idea of my outlook upon life, I cannot say. For years, I kept clear of girls, avoiding their company, and then a couple of years ago learned that, after all, it was no merit. But really, in the eyes of our glorious civilization, a damnable thing. To love a man and hate a woman. I am not a sodomite, but after all, if I met a fellow who would return my love, I cannot see why we should not kiss and caress one another if we wished. Oh, yes, they just love one another, the dear things, and how well suited they are to one another. So say the onlookers to a regular pair of lovers. But in my case, it's fruit, pansy, queenie, sodomite, lunatic. Can I be blamed?
If discovering sympathetic literature had been David's first proper entry into the gay world, building a circle of similarly minded gay friends was the second. David now knew what it meant to be a homosexual, but at first his romantic and social life remained a struggle, mostly because he was drawn towards young, attractive lads who did not necessarily feel the same way. His most tortuous relationship was with a handsome working-class youth called Jack Murray. For over a year in 1931 and 2, David drove this 18-year-old around the city and countryside, gave him money and other gifts, and even found work for his unemployed father. David was determined to ignore the warning signs about Jack's mercenary motives, and imagined their love was a reincarnation of his idol, Oscar Wilde. At the end of the year, he summarised in his diary.
Looking over the year, there has not been very much of importance in a general way, but there have been one or two outstanding items, such as my building of the hut at Oughley, and my sleeping in it for the first time on Saturday the 24th of September, accompanied by Jack Murray, the most charming example of boyish loveliness I have ever met. His entry into my life on Thursday the 2nd of June, when I had my first conversation with him, could be looked upon as the second item of importance. Almost perhaps the most important, as who knows what the outcome may be. I am in heaven with him one moment, or rather perhaps I should say one day, but before it is out, I'm doubting the sincerity of his friendship, consumed, as you might say, with jealousy. Over all there is Jack. Jack. He never leaves my thoughts. But, unfortunately, behind my love, there is the constant nightmare of the public's opinion of a man who loves the boy. Much the same as Mark Thornton in Strange Brother, a book I got in March of this year. I have had many happy moments with Jack, and days of untold misery without him. Sometimes a terrible feeling comes over me to end all and have done with all of my troubles. 36 years of age and in trouble because I am not sure of the love of a boy 18 years of age. We had our photos taken on September 6th, my 36th birthday. I had one taken of Jack and I together, I standing, Jack sitting, in a pose similar to that adopted by Oscar Wilde and Lord Alfred Douglas. As I can see in everything appertaining to my friendship, such a resemblance to Oscar Wilde's love for Lord Alfred Douglas. There was a difference of 18 years in their age, and Douglas, seemingly, was sometimes aggravating to Wilde too. I cannot be blamed, however, if I am a homosexualist, nor am I any whit ashamed of my position. What I dread is the ignorant and unintelligent plebeian or lower-class cry of fruit merchant or pansy, when God knows I am clean, absolutely. Sodomy never entering my head, even although I may put an arm around Jack's shoulder when he's in the car with me. The unintelligent mind knows nothing of David and Jonathan.
But the relationship gradually faltered, as Murray continued to ask for money without giving anything physical in return, and David finally accepted that it was time to move on. He had now accepted that he was different and was defiant, but had still not discovered a life that could be more romantically fulfilling. In late 1933, he lamented,
"This was my birthday. 37. Terrible, terrible. And yet I have not got a genuine friend. What a wonderful thing if Jack would give me his love as I give him mine. Or even if I could find some fellow like him that would love me. Life then would be worthwhile, and not the nightmare it is. I hate walking through the town on account of the fellows I might, and feel I would, like to speak to, wondering if they are my sort or not. I don't mean that every fellow I meet has an attraction, most certainly not. But I meet so many who have an attraction, and yet it is impossible to tell them of my thoughts. Or I might find myself looked at askance as an oddity, or maybe in the hands of the police."
Another day, his lament reached a crescendo after a sermon at church.
Subject: David and Jonathan's love for one another likened to man's love for God. A terrible ordeal for me, seeing that my love is for a male and cannot give voice to it, and yet I feel I must. It is getting so unbearable. And then comes the thought that perhaps the one I love, Jack, may not have the least love for me. And if I say anything, it will only make a fool of myself in his eyes. Sometimes I feel as if I could take Jack out to the hut, make my confession to him, give him all of my love, and if he wavered in the slightest, then murder. No, kill him. Yes, kill him, and then kill myself. It would be freedom. Freedom from the terrible torment of trying to keep to the character one is supposed to have.
Finally, through cruising in the personal ads, David began to build his own circle of gay friends in the mid-1930s. Walter Smith and Cecil Bond, his closest confidants, were of a similar age and social class to him, and perhaps more worldly wise. The men swapped book recommendations and poetry, sent each other amusing and often camp letters, cruised the city centre together, and even introduced each other to potential new lovers. In his diaries, David quotes the conversations and experiences he had with these men, along with many others, in great depth. One rich entry from early 1936 shows just how important this circle of friends was in bringing David out into the gay world that had existed without his knowledge. David was at work when his brother informed him there was a young chap in the office to see me. David went out to the front and saw a smartly dressed youth.
I asked, "What's your trouble?" He smiled. "Cecil Bond asked me to call and see you. I don't know what for." "Oh," I said. "Come into the private office." The youth was quite a pleasant, attractive personality, agreeably spoken. We chatted for a little, and I arranged that he meet me at Bedford Street on Friday evening at 7:45, when we could go to the classic cinema. I am full of hope. Life begins to look brighter.
The date went well. After they'd watched their film, they settled down in a cafe to talk.
Do you do much reading? I asked. Quite a lot, he replied. Any special authors? No, Kipling, H.G. Wells, and so on. We parried for a moment. Then he said, I tried once to get The Well of Loneliness, but I was not able. I smiled. Ever read Strange Brother? Yes, he said, I have. And Twilight Men? Yes. It's a very beautiful book, he remarked. The writer must have been one of the Brotherhood to have been able to know so well what to write about. Yes, I agreed. It is a beautiful book. The conversation was easier after this. We both knew our ground better and were able to talk freely.
The following week, Harry came over to David's house.
We settled down for a chat upon books and so on. Harry in the armchair, I on the sofa. My mother brought supper about 9, so I introduced Harry to her. We had quite a happy time chatting. I, of course, had to bring forth Oscar Wilde. He was more or less a stranger to Harry, so I had great pleasure in reading a few of the poems to him. About 10:15, Harry said that he would have to be going. I was standing with my back to the fire, leaning against the mantelpiece, as he rose from the chair. He was quite close to me. When shall I see you again? I asked. I'm free most nights, he replied. We'll make it Friday, say at 8:30. During this time I was caressing his head and longing to kiss him. I drew his head towards me and I kissed him. My first kiss to a boy. He was more than willing to be kissed and snuggled into me, returning those kisses. In a second or so we were sitting, or rather reclining on the sofa, in each other's arms in an orgy of kissing. Orgy is the best word, I believe. It was not a feast, and yet I was carried away by love. Harry was completely at one with me. We got up from the sofa and I got Harry his coat and helped him on with it. And then, before he left the room, I took his face in my hands and again kissed him. I then saw him away, and so ended my first night of love. It seems strange. So very wonderful.
By the mid to late 1930s, David's life was essentially organised around his homosexuality, and he was increasingly inventive and determined in his approach to making gay connections. David placed coded adverts in the staid Belfast Telegraph and responded to those of other young men. He made countless journeys around Belfast's bustling streets, looking for working-class youths, some who were selling sex and others who were gay themselves. And he managed to get his hands on gay novels from all around the world, from London to Berlin to New York. All of these aspects of his blossoming sexual understanding are described in depth in long and reflective passages in his diaries. A few entries demonstrate just how vibrant and integrated into everyday life Belfast's queer world could be, and just how finding other men worked in practice. In the first entry, David describes picking up a young former naval man in his car in the countryside.
I saw a chap walking along the footpath, so I drew up, and he, without me asking him if he was going along the road, got in and thanked me very much for the lift. Going into Belfast? I asked. Yes, he said. I explained that I would not think of passing a chap on the road if I had room for him in the car, but as far as girls are concerned, I would never give a girl a lift, no matter who you might be. If there was an accident, people would say there must have been some fooling going on. Yes, he said, I agree with you. He said one day, when I was coming from Banbridge, a chap gave me a lift in his car, and a short time after I was in, he began to get funny with me, don't you know? Well, he said, look here, mister, if you want payment of that kind for the lift you give me, you better let me out. I know all about that. You see, I was in the Navy, on HMS Furious, and I knew all about that kind of thing. Flying fish, they were called. Then you do know something of them? You've actually come in contact with them? I said. Yeah, I remember when I was on the Furious at first. I asked one of the chaps what it all meant. So he told me that the first time I wanted a bob or so to come along and let him know and he would explain. From his manner of saying this, I took it that he was making an opening for me to suggest a meeting. You know, you've got to be careful with who you talk with. Yes, I believe you there, I said. I'll tell you more, he said. Any chap who goes with another would rather have that fellow than anyone else. It's almost a year now since I was with anyone, he said. What is the compensation to you for all this? I asked. What compensation does a prostitute get? He asked smilingly. Listen, I'll tell you straight. I'm out of work. I would be glad of anything. I would leave that entirely to yourself. I tell you what, if we become pals, I promise you not to go with anyone else, he said. Well, I'll tell you this much, I said. I rather like you, and I can assure you I've no wish to make a prostitute out of you. You need not worry about me, he said. I don't object.
In another entry, David describes in detail his meeting with an effeminate, makeup-wearing young man in the city centre.
As I drew near Woolworths, I saw in a doorway the youth I met in the Great Northern Railway Station a few weeks ago. As I came along, he saw me, smiled and came to me. How are you keeping? I inquired. Fine, thanks. How are you? Can't complain. You waiting for anyone? No, he said, and started to walk along with me. He was looking very well. You have no one to meet now? I asked. No. Come along to my office then, will you? So we walked along to 20 Bedford Street. Seated and settled, I said, When did you first find out about this business? He leaned on the arm of the chair and with his hands clasped before him, smiled and said, When I worked in Coombe Barbers, I heard of other fellows doing it. Oh? Are there fellows like that there? Yes. I felt a terrible pity for the kid. So good looking, but so done up. Every bit of him, even under the eyes shaded. Do you make a habit of going around town? I asked. Oh, no, I don't. I want you to be perfectly frank with me. Are you in the habit of walking the streets? No, I'm not, he said. I reached over and took his hand and very gently pulled him towards me. He arose and came, and he sat on my knee. Laying his head on my shoulder, I kissed him, and after the third kiss said softly to him, Sweetheart. He smiled. You're not used to being called that. No. Were you ever kissed before? Once, a boy kissed me. What do you do then when you meet new friends? I just tell them that I'll meet them another night and don't go. Just as you did to me the first time. He smiled. You know you shouldn't play with this. You'll only land yourself in trouble. You know you're fearfully made up. That seems so very obvious.
Just a month or so later, when David was cruising the city centre with his friends, he describes all the queer characters and sexual locations they saw.
I then walked along to the Church of Ireland Young Men's Society, where Walter Smith awaited me. I sat there reading until about 10 to 10. Then Smith and I left for a walk. We'd scarcely got into High Street when Dan Murphy and a friend passed, going towards the Albert Clock. Then in a second or so, I saw Hugh Thompson with a fruity-looking individual. Next on the scene was Tommy Miller and a friend. They appeared from an alleyway. Well, Smith and I carried on down High Street and stopped to look in the Dulce's shoe shop. I noticed a youth outside the window looking at me. And as I left the inside, he went in. And as I was looking from outside the window, I saw Tommy Miller then go into him. He was the youth I had seen with Miller before. So, Smith and I away. Just as we approached Shaftesbury Square, I saw a youth who lived in Newton Breda. He was towards my side of the street, a little in front of me. He had a companion with him. He waved to me when he saw me. He hesitated at a weighing machine at the entrance of the arcade. Smith and I stopped. The little chap and his friend came back. I was very much taken with the youth, not to say surprised at his coming back after being halfway through the arcade.
In multiple entries such as these, David Strain's diaries reveal a world that has been assumed almost impossible in cities that were not London, Berlin, or New York before the 1960s, let alone a provincial, religiously zealous region like Northern Ireland. Every aspect of everyday life, from concerts and cinemas to walking and chatting, could bring gay men into contact with others like themselves. For the most part, this world was undisturbed by the police. Rarely more than 1 or 2 arrests for gross indecency took place each year. In over a decade of life on Belfast's scene, David knew of only one man who was arrested for cottaging in a city centre urinal, though he was aware that London was more dangerous. What brought the arc of this queer life to an end? Firstly, the duty that David had towards his mother, with whom he moved out to the countryside in the late 1930s, following the death of his father. He did eventually move back into the city after her death in the 1950s, but by then he was much older and seemingly never found a man to settle down with. And secondly, the Second World War, which for David at least made everyday cruising and socialising less attractive or more dangerous than it had been before. By the early 1940s, the diaries become much sparser and end with a whimper in 1943.